So let me start by introducing the colleagues here, starting on my right, Eskada Nega, who is the Chief of Evaluation at the UNECA. Nega, Eskada is currently in a senior managerial position, and her work is mainly focused on strengthening organizational learning and accountability at the ECA. So she is a long-time serving ECA staff member, and prior to this position, Eskada has been working in supporting and strengthening African member states' capacities in the areas of ICTs policies, regulatory frameworks, and digital economy and innovation for development. So I move on, and I'm going to introduce briefly Ms. Aissatou Gueye. Aissatou Gueye, she has worked for 17 years with ECA, and she's currently the Chief of NEPAD, Regional Integration and Trade Division at the ECA. So prior to this position, she has served as the Chief of the Green Economy and Natural Resources section at the Special Initiatives, so where she provided substantive lead in the establishment of that section. So I move, and then on my far left, I have Dr. Joanne Kagwanja, who is the coordinator of the African Land Policy Center at the ECA, and it was formerly known as the Land Policy Initiative Secretariat. So Dr. Kagwanja, she has over 25 years of experience on African development issues, and she has held a number of positions at the ECA, including at the Alliance for a Green Revolution and the International Livestock Research Institute. So she joined ECA in 2001. So, and then I'm moving to my far right with Mr. Suleiman Abdallah, who is an Economic Affairs Officer at the African Trade Policy Center in the Regional Integration and Trade Division at the ECA. So he joined the ECA as a laureate of the National Competitive Exam, where he has accumulated more than 13 years of experience, ranging from issues of gender and development, financing and development, to industrial and trade policies. So I have introduced the panelists, and thank you for being here for this discussion. We have launched this, the beautiful booklet on ECA 60 Years in Step with African Development. So I would like to go actually to page 12 of this booklet, which gives a timeline of landmark decisions on regional policies and frameworks. And starting in 1957. So I'm just going to select a few landmarks, and I'm going to ask you, panelists, to take us through a retrospective analysis, but also lessons learned and how we are moving forward, starting and focusing on the work of ECA, on how it has contributed to these landmarks and what those landmarks mean for ECA. So let me take 1969. 1969, this was the Conference of Ministers, which established by Resolution 188 9 as the highest legislative organ of the Commission, and comprised the Minister of Governments of the member states responsible for economic and social development planning. And I'm going to ask to Eskada on my right and ask her what really this means for ECA. What does the Conference of Ministers means for ECA in terms of providing strategic direction, in terms of supporting the work of ECA, and making sure that ECA is really responding to the development priorities of the continent? How has it shaped the work of ECA in the last 60 years and moving forward as we are coming in March to the next Conference of Ministers in Marrakech. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Biha. I'll be very quick because in actual fact, during the opening session, the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission has built on a current review of the Commission's intergovernmental structure that we are doing, and he has given you a very interesting and synthesized picture of how difficult it was to begin with to set the Economic Commission for Africa compared to what have happened in other regions, and how the Commission has evolved from a UN entity that was supposed to look at the economic aspect of development and that added the social aspect to it and to the benefit of the other regional commissions, and then later on to be the entity par excellence that would promote regional integration and trade. So in terms of the Commission itself, I think what we are looking at, or what is coming out from the review that we are currently undertaking, is that particularly at the helm of the intergovernmental structure, as you know, is the Commission session and the Conference of African Ministers. And I think it is the main instrument that help us deliver on our convening function. It is the convening function where a number of knowledge products, research, and policy options are presented that member states value for their qualities. On the basis of this research that is produced, policy options are presented for member states through our convening function. And it's also based on the outcomes of this convening function that we have through our intergovernmental processes that we are able then to translate our policy recommendations into concrete operational activities. And I am able to say, on the basis of a very large sample of representatives of member states and other stakeholders that we have interviewed in the process, that really the creation of the Commission, what it brings in terms of deliberation, focused deliberations, agenda setting on issues that are of strategic importance for the continent, is something that is very, very much valued by our delegates. It is also the whole structure beyond the one of the Conference of Ministers, and looking at what we are doing at the sub-regional level and the contribution that the Commission as a whole had in the creation of regional and sub-regional economic and other entities, is something that we should not forget as we look in retrospect what the Commission has achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eskada, and especially in highlighting this convening function that we are able to exercise through the Conference of Ministers. And as you know, the convening function is one of the three key core functions of ECA, in addition to the think tank and that of the operational function. So moving on and looking again at this timeline, we heard earlier this morning the deputy chair of the AUC also talked about ECA and the AUC being actually joined by the HIP. And the timelines and the landmarks that I'm going to select here now on the African continent, but it's also important to hear how ECA has supported. So I'm going to 1980, and this is for Suleiman on my far right. I'm going to 1980 and 1994. In 1980, it was the Lagos Plan of Action for the Economic Development of Africa, 1980-2000, that was adopted by the African heads of states and government. And 1994, it was the treaty that established the African Economic Community. commonly known as the Abuja Treaty, that entered into force. So how, if you look back to 1980, and especially the treaty establishing the African Economic Community, how did ECA actually support this process? And what did we learn from this process, even in terms of moving forward and our continued support to the African priorities?
Thank you, Madam Bia. So this morning we had a very insightful speech which provide us some background into ECA's journey, hand in hand with African Union and African member states in the development discourse and processes all along these last 60 years. But 1980 was really a particular landmark for African development history. You all recall that the first topic on agenda in the 60s was about political independence, and it was about to be completed in the late 70s. So it was about a time to shift the agenda and put more emphasis on the development process on the continent. And we all hear and know about the Lagos Plan of Action, which was adopted in Lagos in April 1998. But before this happened, actually there was another milestone that was achieved and completed in 1979, which was the Monrovia strategy. Because actually the Lagos Plan of Action is just a plan of action. It derived from the strategy that was adopted in Monrovia in 1979. And this strategy was adopted by head of states of African states based on a recommendation coming straight from the ECA Conference of African Ministers. And this is the first time that collectively Africans agree to master actually their development process. So it's about time for them to say, look, we have been relying so much on foreign power, on outside countries, and now we already start experiencing adverse effects, notably the deterioration of the terms of trades. So it's about time for Africa to rediscover its important role to be inner-looking and develop a strategy that responds to that objective. Political independence is achieved. Now it's about time to see and rely on African owned forces, actually. So one of the principles underpinning actually the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980 was the rediscovery of self-reliance and self-sustaining of Africa. And this was pretty much inspired by the then ECA Executive Secretary, Professor Adedeji Adebayo. It was further declined in the Lagos Plan of Action, which by the year 2000 oversee already the creation of the African Economic Community. And this was taken forward actually in the Abuja Treaty of 1991, which came into force into 1994, where African declines the steps that will bring us to an economic entity integrated with major milestone like what we are experiencing nowadays in terms of the coming of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So this is also a major stone that will contribute to the African Economic Community. Why is it important for us? Because we notice clearly, and this is well documented in ECA studies that are practically the resounding justification for the AFCFTA actually, that there is an anomaly that needs to be corrected. When you look at all regions around the world, Europe, they are trading 70% among themselves. Asia, it's 50%. In North America, it's above 30%. It's only in Africa that we are having less than 50% of trade among our countries. So this is an anomaly that needs to be corrected. And the second line of argument is that intra-African trade is more about manufactured products. So it's more prone to bring about the development and the structural transformation that we are calling on the continent if we are to intensify the exchange among us. So, and these are really coming straight from studies conducted by the Economic Commission for Africa. Madam DS, I think I should stop here, and later on we can pursue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Big applause to you for this retrospective, and thank you actually for going back and reminding us about the Monrovia strategy in 1979. We just heard, in a way, the think tank, how ECA had played, even at that time, its a think tank function, but combining it with the convening function and how it was able to influence the continental agenda in terms of coming together as a regional bloc. And we are now in 2018 with the establishment of the Agreement on the African Continental Free Trade Area. So we are going to move and continue actually our historical path and move on a little bit closer to 2001. And I'm going to turn to Aissatu on my left and talk in 2001 about the NEPAD, which was formally adopted as an integrated socioeconomic development framework for Africa by the 37th Ordinary Session of the Assembly of the then Organization of African Unity, held in Lusaka in July 2001. So Aissatu, can you also give us your perspective on that, and what has been the role of ECA in supporting the NEPAD? Thank you.
Thank you very much, DES. You will recall that NEPAD builds on the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980 and the Abuja Treaty of 1991. But how did it come about? At the dawn of the millennium, ECA designed the Compact for Africa's Development. This was to serve as a basis for the operationalization of the MDGs, but with the support of development partners. But around the same period, the presidents of Algeria, Nigeria, and South Africa came up with the Millennium Partnership for African Recovery, the Millennium, for African Recovery Program. And also around the same time, the president of Senegal, Wade at the time, came up with the Omega Plan. So but the visions of these two initiatives puts Africa on a path, or wanted to put Africa on a path of sustained growth and development, but recognizing that Africa is responsible for its own development. And because of the convergence between the visions of these two initiatives, in March of 2001, the heads of state, the OAU, then it was OAU because NEPAD was adopted before the transformation of the OAU to the AU. So the heads of state and government summit of the OAU decided to merge these two initiatives, that's the Omega and the MAP. So at around the same time in May 2001, the ECA Conference of Ministers reviewed the two initiatives and came to the conclusion that the goals were achievable, but should be underpinned by a partnership framework which the compact that was designed by ECA provided. So in effect, NEPAD evolved out of the merger between Omega and MAP plans, both of which were underpinned by the Compact for Africa's Development that was an ECA initiative. So that's the role that ECA played in the formulation of NEPAD. But apart from the formulation of NEPAD itself as a program, NEPAD came up with an action plan And on the basis of that action plan, ECA reorganized or reoriented its programs to support, both at headquarter level and at the SRO level, to support the implementation of NEPAD in most of the priority areas, including the African peer review mechanism, which is the governance component of NEPAD. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aissatou. And I have to say that I'm very excited because I am learning myself a lot of things, including of what Aissatou just presented. In a way, we are seeing the three core functions of ECA coming together. The think tank with this Compact of African Development, and the convening, actually, function where where ECA was able to bring together these two major initiatives. But at the same time, we are seeing that moving forward, what was happening is also this operational support that came in with the support to the NEPAD and the APRM. So, and then we are continuing in this historical path and retrospective analysis. And I'm going to go to Joanne and move to 2004. In 2004, ECA member states endorsed the African Gender Development Index during the Beijing +10 review in Addis Ababa here in October 2004. So we know the African Gender Development Index has one of its components, which is actually access to land or land ownership. And we know also that many African countries actually still depend very much on the agriculture sector, which in some countries comprise actually between 30 or 50% in terms of contribution to the GDP. And in the agriculture sector, women are at the center, especially subsistence agriculture. So the question really here is about women access to land and land ownership. You may wish, actually, Joanne, to give us maybe a little bit a broader view about the land issue in Africa, and then tell us a little bit more in terms of ECA's contribution to the issue of land ownership for women. Thank you.
Thank you, DS. We don't need to be reminded of the importance of land in the context of agriculture, but I think it's good to reflect on the fact that we talk about how women are central to Africa's agricultural transformation if there is going to be one that is meaningful in terms of providing jobs, especially for our youth. Women are 30% less productive than men in the agricultural sector. And we know it's not because women are not smarter. It's not because they are less hardworking. I think it's maybe the opposite. And it's not because they are less caring, because it is because of that food, those little resources that will send their children to school or that will feed their children. But it's because they lack access to productive resources, the first one of them being land. So of course it's really central. And I remember attending ECA at 40 in 1998 here, when we were, in a way, launching the whole women's, I think it was the African Center for Women. And I remember Josephine Ouedraogo at that time was here, and there was this discussion. And after that came, I think, the center, the African Center for Gender Center with Dr. Amako. So for me, it was quite inspiring. And looking at then what kind of contribution can we really make? So in a broader sense, in 2000, ECA did what it knows and convened together with Austria in a small hotel here, experts on land. And there came what we call LandNet Africa. So that's before my time here in 2001. So when I came, I started digging up to find out, what is happening with this network. And us, with Aissatou in the division, and those that were here, Joshua and others, thought of looking at the issue of land in the context of of tenure on sustainable development. We're talking about, looking at sustainable development issues. So ECA produced a knowledge piece, land tenure systems. I would start, first of all, the Sub-Regional Office for Southern Africa produced a book on land tenure systems and sustainable development in Africa. And at the same time, we here were working on a knowledge piece on land tenure systems and their contribution to tenure and sustainable development as well, 2003, 2004. So that's, ECA's contribution goes that far. It doesn't come with the Land Policy Initiative, which was established in 2006. But it's because of that knowledge piece that we asked ourselves, so if we have this knowledge, how are our member states using it in terms of developing policies that would help to address the issues of women, conflict, many other issues as well. And the Land Policy Initiative was established as an initiative of the African Union, the ECA, and Africa Development Bank, but it was at the nudging of the ECA, actually, that it was established. And for those of you who know, we had a journey where we then, in 2009, were able to have ministers of land and agriculture sit here in ECA and endorse and discuss the framework and guidelines on land policy in Africa, which were then endorsed by ministers, and subsequently in 2009 in Silt, endorsed at the AU Summit. So we have the AU Declaration on Land, that I would say a big contribution from ECA. Not to mention the fact that the Secretariat of the Land Policy Initiative has been based at ECA, housed at ECA all those years. When I look at what, since 2009 to now, we've been able to do, it falls in the area of convenings where we've had key decisions at the African Union Summit and specialized technical committees, but it also falls in terms of building capacities of our RECs. We have a program on land at IGAD, building our capacities at member states where we have supported over 19 countries, and also looking at the issue of data, where we have a monitoring and evaluation on land governance framework, also endorsed at the AU level. And moving forward, as you know, we have become the Africa Land Policy Center, the center now which was established at the AU, so it's another institution yet that ECA has contributed to its establishment, much like the other institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. And in a way, we are hearing very clearly, and it's interesting that, as George said earlier, that ECA is at the crossroads, both at the global level in terms of the UN reform agenda that was launched by the Secretary General. And in this reform agenda, the Secretary General has reaffirmed the three core functions of regional economic commissions. And it's interesting to see that ECA has been all along, actually starting in 1969, playing this think tank, convening, and operational functions in a very successful manner. So let me open it. And first of all, a round of applause to our discussants, because they show how focused they were in their presentations with the limited time. So let me open the discussions and open the floor for questions, Q&A. So who are in the room and who like to add your perspectives on what you heard from our colleagues here, you are most welcome. Yes, yes, please, on my right.
Yeah, my name is Rabia here. I'm coming from the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, which is a CG member group. My question goes to the last panelist. We have been witnessing, about in the last 8 years in Africa, the so-called land grabbing. You were in charge of the land policy within the ECA. I would like to understand what is the contribution of ECA regarding to land grabbing in Africa. I know that also FAO did a great job to provide of a kind of guides. They developed a kind of guide. I don't know how did you interact with this or to come out of such kind of, I don't know, regulation for the African countries? Thank you.
There is any other question? Yes, I see two. Yes, on the center left, and Sierra Leone, and then South Africa representatives. Let's start by Sierra Leone.
Thank you so much, Madam Deputy Executive Secretary. It has been really great attending this well-organized event. I note with great interest that the discussions managed to take us through from 1969 to 2004 in a space of maybe 20 minutes. That's really record-breaking. I just have two fairly trivial questions, I suspect. One is for Aissatou, my sister, who talked about NEPAD. A wonderful initiative indeed. But given that APRM is one of the key entities, one of the key components for NEPAD to be a very successful entity of the ECA, and given that, as I speak, 17 out of the 55 AU states are not signatories to APRM, are not utilizing APRM. How could we really help those nations to see the value of APRM in making the work of NEPAD successful and ultimately a very successful Africa? That is one question for me, for Aissatou. The other question is for Joanne, who talked about the event of 2004 up to where we are. I note, browsing through the handbook here, that the commitment of the AU for a 30% target for women's documented rights to land. I'm not sure what are the steps that the ECA could help countries to circumvent some of the entrenched traditional values that hold back our women into having rights to land, rather than always having to rely on traditional leaders, and most of whom, many, if not all, are men in Africa. I thank you.
Thank you for the distinguished representative for Sierra Leone, and going to South Africa.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Let me first thank the panelists for insightful and detailed information in terms of taking us about the genesis and the role that ECA has played over the years. We really appreciate that. But I've got a few questions. I think my colleague here, Honorable Representative from Sierra Leone, has just touched on one, which is mainly on the APRM. Just to add on what he said, my question is basically on the voluntary nature of the mechanism itself, where some member states are, they subscribe to the mechanism, but others are not. Of course, it's on a voluntary basis. Now, going forward from where we are, will that voluntarism of belonging to the mechanism still hold if we were to achieve our objective? That's my question. And then to Abdullah Suleiman, the genesis of the Monrovia strategy, the Lagos plan of action, and so on. I think in between there was a structural adjustment program. I just want to understand what has been the impact of that structural adjustment program vis-a-vis these programs. Has the structural program assisted these plans or initiatives by African government or heads of state to achieve what they wanted, or did it somehow derail their vision, if there's still a relevancy to that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, distinguished delegate from South Africa. So I'm going back to the panel. I don't see other hands. I see George, my colleague. He has a question or comment.
Thank you, DES. My question is sort of a follow-up or adjunct to the questions by the distinguished delegates from South Africa and Sierra Leone on NEPAD. We all know that NEPAD is a program of the African Union. But there are many initiatives that are ongoing. There's the SDGs, the Agenda 2030, there's the AU Agenda 2063. And for a long time, there has been discussion about the integration or full integration of NEPAD itself into the African Union structures. What is the current state of play here?
Thank you, George. And going back to the panelists here, so I will start by my far left, Joanne, on the question on the land grabbing.
Well, thank you, and thank you, panelists. That is what I would have liked to share with you, but we had no time. So this is excellent. You asked the points almost like we had had a discussion, and I told you, please ask me this. Okay. So in what you call land grabbing, the member states decided to be more positive and call it large-scale land-based investments. Sometimes we call it large-scale land-based acquisitions that can turn either into a grab or an investment. ECA, and together with the African Union and the Africa Development Bank, in launching the implementation of the AU Declaration on Land in Lilongwe, which Kitty, who is sitting here, they were actually organizing that launch while I had left and gone to Agra at the time. So during that launch, organized a panel, but even before that, in Lisbon, after all the hype on BBC and other places, decided that as a continent, we also need to sit ourselves and examine the issue of grabs and decide how we are going to turn this into investments. And so at that particular time, after that panel, in Nairobi in 2011, there was then, we endorsed the Nairobi Plan of Action, the action plan on large-scale land-based investments, where our traditional authorities, our governments, and every stakeholder came on board and said, look, we're gonna have to do something about this. And some of what we were asked to do was to look at assessing what actually is happening on the continent, which ECA, through the Land Policy Initiative, led in doing. We have documents on that. And then went again to the summit and said, look, we have developed, which we did, a guideline on large-scale land-based investments on how we can indeed turn that, what you hear, the 60% of land that is on the continent that is still untapped. How do we turn that into investments for us? And so the guiding principles, 6 fundamental principles, the 19 principles help us to then look at how we can make them financially viable, but also look at how we safeguard the environment and protect our communities as well. And so that's a useful document. Then after that, together with the Africa Development Bank, we've been implementing programs that support member states in terms of how you would utilize this. Most recently, we were in Malawi I think a month ago, training the ministries of lands on how you negotiate investments. We were in Guinea, looking at different ways that you can tap the land that you have instead of importing so much rice. So as ECA, I think we are leading in providing the technical assistance now that is that is going to help us to indeed turn investments, not grabs, especially for domestic investors. So look forward to working with Summit on some of these issues. I think on the issues of women's land rights, again, thank you for asking the question so that we can talk a little bit about the 30% target. So we started by, again, looking at knowledge, which is where we go at ECA, and we asked ourselves, well, what's happening with our member states in terms of addressing the challenge that we know exists? And we wanted to look at the knowledge piece at the beginning, where we had the document on securing land rights for women and strengthening access to land. And with that, we were able to then go again to the specialized technical committee that looks at issues of agriculture, rural development, environment, and climate change issues, and present a case for a target that by 2025, member states needs to move towards ensuring that of all the documented land in their countries, 30% of it is documented to women. So of course, that means that we need to have the baselines, which is a challenge itself, because we don't have the data. And so we are working with the Center of Statistics to look at how do we actually get first the data that is there. And we are also working with the custodians of the SDG 5, which is FAO, and with the custodian of another SDG that looks at the issue of land, which is the World Bank and UN Habitat, to look at how we collect this data to make sure that we are tracking this particular target. But in way of supporting countries, again, it's looking at how we can review our legislative frameworks, but also work with traditional authorities like you've mentioned. So we, working together with the Africa Development Bank, facilitated the establishment of the Forum for African Traditional Authorities. So those who are here last year at the conference, you saw almost 40 chiefs here because they are a good partner for us in looking at this. We had an ADF here, which looked at traditional governance. That gave us the motivation to ask ourselves, what is the role of traditional authorities? They're the ones giving away the land. They're the ones who can provide access to land for women. So that is a platform that we are using to bridge that gap between the knowledge, the decisions, commitments, and practice in effect. I think I stop here.
I think you did give a comprehensive response. Let's go to Aissatu, especially in relation to the questions on NEPAD and APRM.
Thank you. Thank you very much, DS. And thank you very much to those of you who posed this very important question about, I think it's very pertinent, on APRM. But I only wish that my colleagues Hodan and Melaku were here to add to whatever I would have to say. Where's Hodan?
Malaku is there.
Oh, Melaku, you're here. Melaku, come close. That's Stephen.
If I may, I had asked also colleagues who worked longer than you on these initiatives to come in and give their perspective.
Okay, all right. So in view of that, I would like to probably hand over to Melaku to start responding to the question. If I have anything to add, I will do so. Thank you very much.
Very good. To you, Melaku.
Okay, thank you for that opportunity. And I think the question that was raised about the APRM is very pertinent. As the colleagues in the room will know, there was a decision recently to ensure that the APRM is more closely integrated into the AU systems and processes on the basis of the new statute. The budget of the APRM was made part of the AU regular budget just recently. And there is that lingering question of whether and how far we can keep the APRM as a voluntary process, while it is on the one hand part of the AU systems. To what extent can we really keep it as a voluntary process in which so far only 37 of the 55 member countries of the AU are members of the APRM? This is a question that has been there for some time, I think. And the understanding, as I read it so far, is, yes, it must stay as a voluntary process. There is an encouragement to make sure that what we have been calling universal accession to the APRM, the universe here being Africa, there is a commitment to make sure that all countries will join the APRM, but join on a voluntary basis. And partly the reason that is a good approach, in my personal opinion, is even from the 37 countries that are members of the APRM, not all of them are actively participating in the peer review process today. So bringing them into the AU, sorry, the APRM, bringing all the AU members into the APRM, and allowing them to continue as members while not doing anything about it, I don't think it will serve any purpose. And the understanding so far is, look, let's show what APRM is capable of doing. It's a force for good in the continent. It tries to address a critical deficit on the governance side of the continent. So the effort that has been spearheaded by a number of leaders, especially in the revitalization process with President Kenyatta over the previous 2 years, was how can we make sure that this institution is necessary for all of us. Yes, it's an option for everybody to decide, exercising their sovereign free will to become a part of it or not to become a part of it, but ultimately the APRM has to prove, we all have to understand how valuable an instrument it is, and the APRM has to prove its worth. That is exactly the approach that has been taken. And I believe we will achieve the universal accession, but I am looking forward to a time when all APRM members are actually going to be actively engaged in the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malaku. May I go back to Aissatu for complementary remarks?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Malaku, for that. At the last extraordinary summit of the African Union that was held here in November, it was agreed that the APRM will be strengthened to track implementation and oversee monitoring and evaluation in key governance issues. My sense is that maybe maybe the lack of that universal participation could have a reason from the fact that countries do not see the benefits of the mechanism, because maybe after preparing the action plans, these are not being implemented. But I do not really, but maybe once the action plans are implemented and countries start seeing concrete results and showcasing these results, that would encourage others to be part of the mechanism. In addition to that, the mechanism, I think that the voluntary nature of the mechanism should be maintained, because it's being seen all over the world as successful, in the sense that it is bringing people together, engaging people in the development process, engaging them, getting them involved, talking about it, reaching consensus on key governance indicators. I think in that sense, it is successful and it's really appreciated. Even at the level of New York, when there were discussions on a peer review mechanism for Agenda 2030, the APRM in Africa was identified as a mechanism that could be used for that. So I think that given that, if that comes to fruition together with Agenda 2063, and these are development initiatives that almost all countries have subscribed to, if the APRM provides a platform for peer review and learning on these two key global and continental development agendas, that would kind of motivate people to come in. So I think that let's leave it at a voluntary mechanism, but find ways and means of making it attractive to countries. That said, on NEPAD, thank you very much, George. I would like to echo Joanne in saying that I think I needed that question because I totally omitted the RCM. Another initiative that ECA is coordinating, but now it has evolved from a coordination mechanism of UN agencies working in Africa in support of the AU and its NEPAD program to a joint mechanism of the UN and AU. And the mechanism now has 4 sub-regional mechanisms that is supporting it, going down to the REC level, and ensuring that the priority development agendas of regional economic communities are taken on board in terms of the implementation of Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030. So with regard to NEPAD being integrated into the structures of the AU, at the same extraordinary summit, it was agreed that NEPAD would be transformed to an African Union Development Agency, like the UNDP of AU, if you like, and that it will serve as the continent's technical interface with all Africa's development stakeholders. So that is taking place. It has started, and I think that at the level of ECA and UN partners, particularly in the context of the mechanism, we could envisage maybe support in terms of institutional transformation, but we would need to hear from AU regarding exactly what they want in relation to that process. That said, we have the AU. It's an opportunity to talk about the the ongoing UN reforms, and of course the AU reforms. The AU reforms are now clear. For the UN reforms, we are at the first stage, and there's the regional optimization, phase 1 of the regional optimization of the UN reforms. And here, we're looking at RCM as a mechanism, and the regional UNDG mechanism working together closely so that we can have a fit-for-purpose mechanism at the regional level, but together with strengthened mechanisms at the sub-regional and national level, speaking to each other, thus ensuring that we provide effective support to Africa in the implementation of the 2 agendas. We have now a draft action plan of the 2 mechanisms, and we're now looking at a framework for collaboration, which will be finalized very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Aissatou. Now, last not least, I think this is the final question. Given the time we have, I don't think I'm going back to the floor. So to you, Suleiman, and is the question from the distinguished delegates from South Africa in terms of the period that you have reviewed and whether the structure adjustment programs have derailed, in a way, the program of actions that were put in place. Thank you.
Thank you. I must say that one of the most lasting effect, actually, of the Lagos Plan of Action was the radical shift it bring about the perception of economic development policies and the strategies on the continent. You know, to put it in Adedeji's own word, development at that time was perceived by many African countries, newly independent, as creating a new British in Africa, a new France, a little Russia, and so on. So for the first time, by adopting the Lagos Plan of Action, they collectively agreed that they should be inward-looking and develop strategies for self-reliance and self-sustaining of countries and increase cooperation among African countries. So this was kind of radical shift, and it brought new confidence into Africans and African leadership regarding development issues. A contrario, the structural adjustment program have a more liberal approach. You know, it's built on the World Bank Berg report and what was coined as the Washington consensus. It's all about, you know, the triumph of liberalism and the free market. So unfortunately, in the historical context of the Lagos Plan of Action, the crisis worsened in Africa, and most of our countries have no choice but go at last resort to borrow from the international financial institution. And these were the condition actually for them to be eligible to get a program with this institution. It's, you know, to abide by a set of measures that are radically different actually from what was provided into the Lagos Plan of Action. So it was kind of, in terms of implementation, the Lagos Plan of Action was kind of put in bracket, I should, I should put it that way, because the recommendation and resolution that were there were not followed properly during these 2 decades up to 2000. But nevertheless, the spirit was there, and we saw it quickly after the debate becomes more and more strong on intellectual issues, including in the 90s, you know, when ECA came with this alternative framework to the structural adjustment program. We have to recognize that African countries should be in the driver's seat when it comes to development policy and development programs. And that's what we witnessed in these last 2 decades when the growth came back again on the continent and all the issue of Africa rising and so on. So that's what I will say at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Suleiman. And I don't see any other hands. It's past 2:30. I'm going to ask our panelists for a 1-minute final word. They have been very efficient, very substantive and focused. So, but this time I'm going to ask them a final word about the future in terms of the areas that they have presented. So this time I'm going to start by you, Suleiman, the only man on this panel. So you have been quite courageous, and so what is your final word now that we have the African CFTA and going to the future, projecting ourselves in the future? You have all 60 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Not only because I'm optimistic by nature, but I should say that the future is bright on this continent. Mostly, when I hear to the young people, we witness some of these courageous and talented young people around, but also our fundamentals in terms of economic, in terms of social and political environment are evolving in a positive manner. So we have the AFCFTA. I'm just coming back from Lome. They have ratified the agreement. We'll get the 22 countries required for the agreement to come into force. And we all know that, you know, the AFCFTA is one of the flagship project of the Vision 2063 of the African Union. And we will be very soon in a position, you know, to get the fruits from all this effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suleiman. Eskada.
Thank you, Madam Biha. I was quite, again, me too, quite inspired by the young people who had attended the session. There's one major initiative, Madam Biha, that we have forgotten in terms of including in this booklet. It is the initiative by Mr. Amoako, the former executive secretary of ECA, that had helped crafted the African Information Society initiative. At the time where there were more lines, phone lines in Manhattan than in Africa. At the time where there was no mobile transaction, and that was an inspiration for the mobile money applications that Africa innovated on. So I think moving forward, the future is in the youth, the future is in innovation, the future is in building on technology and knowledge for entrepreneurial thinking. We'll make sure we'll add that in this booklet, and we hope that we will be able to have a growth that is not jobless, but that would create jobs for the youth based on their entrepreneurial capacity, their knowledge, and what technology can offer.
Eskada, now to Isatu.
Thank you very much, DS. For me, the future is bright. We can see that Africa, it's taking its development into its hand. It's responsible for its development. It has, it's been undertaking so many important initiatives, you know, and with partners supporting, but they're in the lead. ECA, and indeed UN agencies working in Africa have supported the formulation and the implementation of NEPAD and continue to support the implementation of African programs priority development programs at the regional and sub-regional levels. Now we see NEPAD being transformed into the AU Development Agency. So our work is cut out for us. So we should leverage the ongoing UN reforms to ensure that we enhance support in terms of being more coordinated and more coherent. So we'll listen to AU regarding the support that is required in this area, the transformation process of NEPAD into the AU Development Agency, and we're ready to accompany them in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Aissatou, and Joanne.
Thank you. I think based on the contribution I think that we have made in the different thematic areas, I take we learned from what's happening from our counterparts in Europe, the regional commission there. They had a small working party on land administration. We thought it was a good idea. So we started something in Africa, and we perfected it. We did a lot better. They will admit it themselves. And now we are the example, because it's only Africa now that has a unified agenda on land. So we are the example that our colleagues from ECLAC and our Asian colleagues are looking at as examples. We are the ones helping them to craft concept notes. I think we've done this before. We have countries that came to Africa to look at our development plans, and they used them and they perfected it. I think we need to go back to, it's almost like, it reminds me of Lion King, and us being told to go back to remember who we are. And I think we need to keep remembering who we are in moving ahead and making the continent shine. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists, and also to this final word in terms of going back and getting to know and understand who we are. As we all know, starting from 1st of January 2019, ECA is starting to implement its new and revamped program of work with 5 strategic directions. We have also, our teams have also distributed the revised strategic framework for 2018-2019. And listening to the 4 panelists here, they were very clear in terms of moving forward with a very bright future. And also what was interesting to me, listening to all of them, it seemed that actually there was a kind of sequencing even in the core functions of ECA in their presentations. There was this sequencing that always started with the think tank role, the knowledge search and generation, and then in some cases going directly to the convening role, where actually ECA was able to influence policymakers based on the knowledge products that, and the research work that ECA did. And then moving on to the operational function. It was quite interesting that I was listening to 4 of them, and with Eskada giving the big picture of the convening role, and the Conference of Ministers giving that platform for the convening, but also providing the strategic direction. I think it's very good for ECA, because we can very proudly and authoritatively say that we are already implementing the global SG reform in terms of the core functions of the regional economic commissions. So we have heard from them. It's a very bright future. And we heard that they were all inspired by the youth that we saw today. So let me actually invite you and to thank our 4 panelists who gave us a retrospective, but also short perspective of ECA's work in the big picture of the African continent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tudor.